I think we've seen a real contrast in leadership during this a conflict. You have Zelensky. I know you all call him Zelensky, so I'll go along with that. I don't mind that. Zelensky. He's been valorized, right? Although that's harder and harder to do these days. But for the last 7+ months, he has been given a hero's welcome by the West. He's been praised. He's been called this brave democratic leader on the front lines. And then you have Putin on the other side being maligned viciously, constantly. There's no stop to it. It's that Putin is an oligarch, as you said, Alexander, right? He's always associated with being an oligarch. Very questionable. He's a dictator. Again, very questionable with that amount of public support. So, what has this crisis? I feel like this is a crisis of leadership, because then you have the EU in the US in a very particular kind of crisis of leadership as well, shooting themselves in the foot, almost committing suicide economically, while also bringing the world to the brink. Like, what is this crisis of leadership telling us about where the world is going? Because I think the Ukraine situation is really about that. And I know, Alex, you brought up a little bit of that, but I wonder if you all wanted to expound on this point about this crisis of leadership we're seeing.
Well, again, if I can just start, what is the key to understanding why Putin is able to make strong decisions? I talked about the elite consensus behind him. The key is to understand that he works on the basis of Russian national interests. That is why he has the support of Russian society in what he does. There's always some people who aren't happy, but always the concern is what Russian nationalist interests are and how to defend them and how to pursue them. And of course, the contrast that many Russians make, and I don't just mean elite Russians, but also, people you meet, in cafes, on the street, whatever, is what happened at the end of the 1980s and 1990s, when the sentiment was that the political leadership was not acting in Russian national interests anymore. Now, what we see in Europe, and what I think is causing this enormous crisis within the political class in Europe, is that, by contrast, it is not any longer acting in the national interests of the countries that it is supposed to be leading. You can see that in every place. We started this program with that discussion in Germany, in France, in Britain, wherever leaders are making decisions which are no longer directly in the interests of their countries. They are in the interests of achieving projects which many people would say are utopian projects. And that, of course, is a fundamental difference. And having that grasp of Russian national interest, and if you follow Russian political debate, they're quite open about this. This isn't something that they are embarrassed about. They talk about it regularly and openly. On the one hand, it gives them power. It gives them what Russians themselves refer to as the power of decision, because you have to have the power of decision to decide what your interests are, to make the decisions, to execute those interests, to follow them through. But it also means, since you're working in a straightforward way, pursuing your interests, your approach is realistic, because it is founded upon the realities of what your nation, as you define it, needs. Now, that means understanding what your nation's interests are. It's economic, it's foreign policy interests, but it also means a very acute understanding of the limitations of your own power. In the West, we've lost that. We've lost that sense of the fact that power has its limits. We think that because we want something, we can just make a decision, or what we think is a decision. We can talk to ourselves and it will come about. So we can impose massive sanctions on Russia. We might not actually know very much about the place, and we can assume that it's all going to turn out as we expect, because after all, that's the kind of world we inhabit. and in a world where what we want is what we expect to see. Russians don't think like that. Putin certainly doesn't think like that. As I said, he consults widely. He consults widely in Russia itself. He talks to experts. He talks to his various foreign partners. He talks to the Indians. He talks to the Chinese. He talks to the Saudis. He's not concerned about what they might do in his own country, in their own countries. He's always focused on what Russia's interests are.
Yeah. Anything you want to add, Alex?
Well, the leaders in the West, they just don't listen to what other leaders are saying. I mean, you go back to Ukraine and how we ended up in this mess. We had the Minsk Accords. For 8 years, the West, specifically Germany and France, they didn't push Ukraine. Two presidents, Poroshenko and then Zelensky, they didn't push them to follow the Minsk Accords. Why didn't they push them to follow the Minsk Accords? Because they weren't acting in the interests of their own countries. Because if they had pushed both of those presidents to follow the Minsk Accords, then Europe would not have this conflict. Instead, what were they doing? They were acting in the interests of a different government, of different people, say neocons in the State Department, who kept on pushing them and telling them, don't allow Ukraine to follow the Minsk Accords. Don't allow them to recognize Crimea. Don't allow them to be neutral. Don't allow them to have Donetsk and Lugansk be a part of Ukraine in a type of federal structure. Remember, that's what the Minsk Accords said. They actually said that Donetsk and Lugansk would be part of Ukraine. They would just be part of Ukraine with more autonomy. It would be a type of federal republic. And they would recognize Crimea and it would be over. But nope, they couldn't do it. And Russia kept on telling the West, listen, these are our concerns. We can't have NATO move further east. We can't have Ukraine move into NATO. We have to follow the Minsk Accords. We can't have the bombing of Donbass. We can't have Ukraine killing civilians. And 8 years passed and nothing happened. The West kept on escalating. It kept on escalating until we got to the point where the issue came up for Ukraine to enter NATO again. Just like that, out of the blue. Ukraine has to enter NATO now. And Russia's like, hold on, what have we been saying for 8 years? Well, Ukraine has its own national interests. And if a country wants to enter NATO, it absolutely has the right to enter NATO. Okay, I say that's fine. Point taken. But what about the neighboring country and their national interests? You see, you have to look at both sides. It's not just a one-way thing of whatever I want, I get. That's not how life works. That's not how diplomacy and politics and geopolitics works. Just because I want something, just because I want to enter NATO, just because I want missiles, just because I want this and that, it doesn't mean I get it without the concerns of my neighbors around me. That's not how things work. And this is the fundamental problem that we have with leaders in the West. They're not listening. They're not taking the concerns of other countries in mind, other great powers. I mean, there are great powers in the world now. There's Russia, there's China, there's India, there's Brazil. There's a lot of countries that are rising, that are great powers or are rising to be great powers. You have to listen to them. They don't listen.